Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I do want to respect people's time. We plan on trying to stick to as tight a timeline as we can with these update webinars. So just want to say hello and good afternoon. Welcome to everybody that's joined. My name is Colin Robbins. I am with the Nebraska Public Service Commission. We'll do some additional introductions here in just a minute, but I thought initially we would probably be just good to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, we obviously would like people to stay on mute throughout most of the presentation unless you're speaking, obviously. This webinar is going to be recorded, so that will eventually be available on the website you see on the screen there, broadband.nebraska.gov. It's likely we'll put a copy of it up on the Public Service Commission's website as well, which is psc.nebraska.gov. Let's see, a couple other items. Like I mentioned, I think we're going to plan to try and stick to the 1 hour time window as closely as we can. With that being said, we do want to be respectful that people might have questions. If we start to kind of run over, well, our plan is to have you ask questions in the chat box. So if you do have questions, please put those in that chat box. If there's time, we will try to get to some of them. If there's not, we will take a transcript of those, answer them separately, and put those out on the website with answers at that time. So last thing I wanted to mention, housekeeping wise, we're still, the contact list of stakeholders is still a work in progress. So if you were forwarded this meeting information or don't think you're on our mailing list otherwise, please let us know. Let me advance the slide here. Please, there's an email address on the screen there, connectnebraska@nebraska.gov. Please let us know, send your information to that email, and we will make sure you're included in future items for the meeting. Okay, with that, I think everybody hopefully has seen the agenda ahead of time. There might be, I think maybe items 6 and 7 we might flip around a little bit, but generally this is the list of items that we plan to cover over the next hour. And with that, I will move on to introductions. Again, my name is Colin Robbins. I'm Director of Telecom and our Nebraska Universal Service Fund Department with the Nebraska Public Service Commission. I think we'll want to really introduce the Connect Nebraska Working Group. So those are the folks that are with different state agencies that work on, will be working on different aspects of federal broadband programs. So I would just ask for those of you that are part of the working group, if you are able to turn your camera on, to please do so. And I will start maybe with people that are from different agencies besides the Public Service Commission, and then finish with the Public Service Commission personnel that are members of this working group. So maybe Ann Byers, would you mind unmuting yourself quickly and introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Ann Byers with the Nebraska Information Technology Commission and Office of the CIO, and I'll be heading up the state's digital equity planning efforts.
Thanks, Ann. And we'll have a little bit of time, a few slides down, for Ann to talk a little bit more about what that is, digital equity. But thank you for introducing yourself. Let's see, Patrick Redmond, are you on the webinar? Maybe otherwise disposed, but Patrick Redmond is the State Broadband Infrastructure Coordinator. He's been obviously part of our discussions and work as a working group, and helps direct some of the conversations around the federal programs. I didn't see Stevensberry on. I didn't see his window pop up, but he's with the Governor's Policy Research Office. He's been involved in some of these discussions as well. And then with that, I will move on to some of our Public Service Commission personnel. So first person I see is Sally. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sally Dietrich. I'm an attorney with the Public Service Commission.
And Carrie, we'll be hearing a lot from Carrie during this presentation. Carrie, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Gans. I'm Assistant Telecommunications Director with the Public Service Commission.
And Eric Harrison.
Hi, I'm Eric Harrison. I'm the internal auditor for the commission.
And Shanna Knudsen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanna Knudsen, and I'm a broadband attorney with the commission.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, one other person I would like to introduce. I haven't seen him pop up yet on the screen. Tom Rolfus. Tom Rolfus is our contact with the NTIA. So he is a kind of our federal liaison. Just wanted to make sure that we made a point to introduce him. Tom, I don't know if you're out there. I haven't seen you pop up, but
Colin, I'm joining via the 202 number.
Perfect.
Thanks for the introduction. Federal Program Officer assisting the Connect Nebraska Working Group.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. Okay, I think that is essentially the working group team. So just wanted to make that introduction so that you guys are able to put faces with names. We obviously won't go around to everyone to introduce themselves, but just wanted to mention that we have a pretty wide range of stakeholders that were invited to this meeting. And thank you all for joining. And we hope this will be informative. We really want to give an overview of, in particular, the BEAD program, the BEAD portion of the NTIA's federal efforts to promote digital equity and broadband deployment. So let's see. A couple of resources I wanted to really briefly mention. There are a few websites that I think are probably important resources for everyone to be aware of. First one is the main site that we are using is kind of the landing page for broadband related items related to all these efforts. So broadband.nebraska.gov. You should be able to go there and see all meeting updates, scheduled meetings, that sort of thing. The existing Nebraska broadband map is broadbandmap.nebraska.gov. You can go there and look at a pretty wide array of information about broadband efforts that are underway today, both through our Nebraska Universal Service Fund and also through our Broadband Bridge program. You can also look at a lot of the areas that are being addressed through federal programs like federal USF. The USDA's Reconnect program. There's some layers that show some of the Nebraska areas that were awarded funding through that as well. Finally, the FCC broadband map. We're going to go into that in a lot more detail later, so I won't hit on it too much at this point. But broadbandmap.fcc.gov is a pretty important URL to have in the back of your mind as we work through some broadband issues and try and figure out ways to make the FCC's broadband map as accurate as possible. Also want to just take a second to mention kind of the scheduling for these type of meetings. We kind of consider this kickoff meeting to be the first in a series of meetings where we try to provide updates on what's going on through the BEAD program. Our next webinar will be January 18th at 2 o'clock Central Time. And at that time, we'll probably try to announce a more regular schedule for how these meetings will occur. At this point, having that meeting scheduled for January 18th is just kind of getting us through the holiday season here, and then we plan to start doing some more regular outreach activities at that time. So January 18th is the important date, and at that time we'll probably announce some additional information on when future meetings will be held. So, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie. I don't want you guys to have to watch me talk this whole time, so Carrie's going to go into a lot more lot more detail on how these programs work and what they involve. So with that, I will turn it over to Carrie.
Thanks, Colin. So to kind of kick things off, we'll just talk a little bit about the Nebraska Public Service Commission, who we are, what we do. The commission is a constitutionally created state agency. We regulate the commission regulates a number of different public service including telecommunications carriers. So the commission is governed by 5 elected commissioners, and they are elected by district. And you can see right there, the legislative or the commission districts there in the map there. And I think, Colin, did you have anything to add on that slide? So next, we'll talk a little bit about National Telecommunications and Infrastructure Administration programs, just kind of a general overview of the different programs that are included, that they're currently running at this time. They're running 4 kind of main programs. The first being that we'll talk about is Middle Mile. That program is administered directly by the NTIA. It's designed to support middle mile infrastructure, or the backbone infrastructure that connects local networks. Another program is the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. That program is administered by the NTIA. There were 3 Nebraska-based grant awards announced through that program. The first one being the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska. They were awarded $3.75 million for infrastructure deployment. Their plan is to utilize fixed wireless to serve 19 anchor institutions, 710 unserved Native American households, and 12 Native American businesses. The second of the 3 awards was for Nebraska Indian Community College. They were awarded $1.243 million for connecting 1,272 unserved Native American households with fixed wireless. And then the third of those 3 awards was for Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, who were awarded $35.25 million for a fiber deployment serving 602 unserved tribal households, 40 unserved tribal businesses, and 16 unserved tribal community anchor institutions. So next we'll kind of, I'll kick it over to Anne for a little bit to talk about the digital equity planning efforts.
Thanks, Carrie. Nebraska will be receiving approximately $600,000 to develop a state digital equity plan, which promotes digital equity and inclusion. We'll be working with the state's economic development districts to develop regional economic development plans, and we will be building on those regional plans to develop a state plan. We're planning to start a series of weekly webinars starting in January on various topics related to digital equity. And if anyone is interested in participating, please contact me or your regional economic development district.
Thanks, Anne. So the digital equity planning, we're working closely with the NITC OCIO, but that part of the program in Nebraska is being administered by that state agency, the NITC OCIO. And then for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment program, that program will be administered by the Nebraska Public Service Commission. So we'll kind of go over to the next slide and provide, so over the next few slides, I'll be providing an overview of the BEAD program, along with a timeline and some of the BEAD milestones. So for the Broadband Equity and Access Deployment, that is a funding source provided through the agency National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. It was established by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Nebraska is expecting a minimum allocation of $100 million with additional funding made available depending upon the number of unserved locations in high-cost areas as a proportion of the total high-cost locations in the nation. This determination will be made based on the FCC map released in November, which Colin will give a little bit more of an outline of later on and kind of a demonstration of that. Nebraska did get approval for planning funds, and we received approval for our planning funds in November 15th, 2022. We're expecting to hear of the award amounts for the states by June 30th of 2023 at this time. So that's what we're planning. So I think the next slide will kind of talk a little bit about the purpose of the program. So the program will lay the critical groundwork for widespread access, affordability, equity, and adoption of broadband, create good paying jobs, grow economic opportunities, including for local workers, provide increased access to healthcare services, enrich educational experiences of students, close long-standing equity gaps, and improve the overall quality of life across America. Deploying broadband service to unserved locations is the focus, and unserved locations are those without any broadband service at all, or with broadband service offering speeds below 25 megabits per second downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream, as well as underserved locations, which are locations without broadband service offering speeds of 100 megabits per second downstream and 200 megabits per second upstream. Within the program, there is a 25% match requirement unless NTIA waives the requirement for certain high-cost areas. The matching contribution can come from a subgrantee, an eligible entity, a unit of local government, a utility company, a cooperative, a nonprofit or philanthropic organization, a for-profit company, regional planning or governmental organization, a federal, regional commission or authority, or any combination thereof. Clearly, with the amount of funding coming through this program, there is an extensive planning and outreach expected or required to take place. So we will be doing a lot of planning and outreach activities over the next several months. And it does require completion of a 5-year plan once the initial planning funds are awarded, as well as an initial proposal and final proposal after notice of funding amounts are released. So we kind of talked a little bit about the minimum requirement for deployment. So I guess the minimum requirement for deployment is 100 megabits per second downstream and 20 megabits per second upstream. So kind of talk about the timeline for the program, kind of where we've been, where we're going. Some of the highlights, the BEAD notice of funding opportunity, kind of laying out the program requirements. That was released in May 13th, 2022. On November 18th, 2022, the FCC released the National Broadband Map to the public to launch a challenge process. Challenges are due by January 13th, 2023. And the challenge process pertaining to is pertaining to the state's BEAD allocations. So the challenges can impact the state's BEAD allocations. We want to make sure that the map is accurate so that we, as citizens of Nebraska, get the funding that we are expected or intended to receive. So, and again, by June 30th, 2023, NTIA plans to announce those BEAD allocations for the states. Starting from 2024 to 2028, that's the estimated time frame in which the 4-year implementation of BEAD will occur. So there'll be a lot of planning leading up to that, clearly. So talking a little bit about Nebraska BEAD milestones, I think, Colin, were you going to go ahead and take it from this point?
Yeah, I can kind of start in from here.
All right, thank you.
And thanks, Carrie. Appreciate all that information. Yeah, we just wanted to go over some of the Nebraska-specific milestones that have been either crossed or are in our immediate future. The first one you see on the list there is the letter of intent to participate in the program. That was due to the NTIA in July of this year. That was essentially a letter from the governor expressing interest in participating in the program and designating the entity that would be working to administer the BEAD program and the digital equity program. Whoops, let me accidentally advance that. Once the letter of interest was submitted, the state was required to submit a request to NTIA for initial planning funds. The state did that prior to the due date of August 15th. And essentially that was just requesting the NTIA to release some initial funds to support planning activities, essentially getting ramped up to be able to administer the BEAD program as it stands today. Subsequent to that, on November 15th, Nebraska was approved for those initial planning funds, and that was essentially the start date of the BEAD program for all intents and purposes. That was when the period of performance, as they call it, begins. So probably one of the next big milestones in terms of the BEAD specific program is that on the 12th of August, we are responsible for completing a 5-year action plan that's due to the NTIA. That would be approximately 270 days after that initial planning funds award was made. So 270 days after November. And I might have to double check that date, but I think that should be right, from 270 days. Then a couple other important milestones to make sure everybody understands. We have an initial proposal due to the NTIA. That's essentially a proposal for how we plan to distribute the money once it's received. That is due 180 days after the notice of funding amounts are received. And we also need to make that available, that proposal available for public comment prior to submission to the NTIA. Another thing to keep in mind, we're going to be talking about a lot of different challenge processes, so hopefully we can try and keep those all straight in people's heads. But there is a required challenge process after we submit the initial proposal, but before we start actually handing out funds for broadband deployment, that allows interested parties to challenge for eligibility for that funding. So it would be, when we release that initial proposal with information about where we've identified unserved and underserved locations, there's an opportunity at that point for interested parties to challenge that information and say, hey, we think this area should be eligible for funding because we think it's unserved. So that's part of the process, and that will likely happen sometime probably late next year or early 2024. And then finally, in 2025, that date is estimated, but we'll have a final proposal that's due to the NTIA that is a little more comprehensive about how money has been allocated. And we do have a more detailed timeline of those events on the broadband.nebraska.gov website. Okay. So that's kind of the general timeline. Wanted to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more about the 5-year broadband action plan that will be due in August, and talk a little bit more about what that's going to require, in part because that will be primarily what we are working on over the next several months through outreach activities and as we're trying to kind of formulate this action plan. As you can see on the screen there, the plan really sets up what the state's broadband goals are and what our priorities are as a state, and looks at what our existing infrastructure looks like, and kind of establishes where we are, looks at where we need to go, and that plan itself informs the state's initial proposal. And in order to generate this action plan, it requires collaboration with local and regional entities. So this is a little bit more detailed breakdown of what goes into the 5-year action plan. Like I said, it details what our existing broadband programs consist of. We kind of catalog all the activities that are part of broadband deployment. You know, we at the Public Service Commission administer a few different broadband related programs, including our State Universal Service Fund, the Broadband Bridge Program, and some others. So it's kind of a catalog of what the existing programs are, what the existing funding opportunities are for broadband deployment statewide. And then we also go into what the efforts are that are funded by the federal government. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are federal efforts apart from BEAD and from BEAD to deploy broadband in Nebraska, including a federal universal service fund and USDA reconnect grants and those kind of things. We catalog current employees that'll be assisting in implementing and administering the BEAD program and what their duties are. We identify potential obstacles or barriers to implementation. We are required to inventory our assets as it lists there. So in other words, what are the efforts that are going on now to address broadband adoption, affordability, access, and deployment, and talk about any relevant partners that might be part of that conversation. We go into some of our details on how we're going to engage external parties, including collaboration with local and regional entities. We will be reaching out to tribal and native entities to assess their needs and talk about where things are for them as well. And we look at what adoption and availability data is available, and use all that information to look at what the service needs and gaps are. And then we build that comprehensive high-level plan for how we're going to reach every unserved location with high-speed broadband. Part of this entire process for developing the 5-year plan involves some collaboration with Ann and the people that are working on digital equity, the digital equity planning process, and the goals of the digital equity group will also be incorporated into what we do with the 5-year action plan. So digital equity and those efforts are an important part of our planning process. And then we just identify, you know, what sort of technical assistance and additional capacity might be needed to accomplish those goals. So that's a pretty high level overview of what goes into the 5-year action plan. As I mentioned, we'll be working on that in the coming months, and additional details of some of the outreach activities will be forthcoming for that. So a couple of other next steps that the Commission is working on to address needs for the BEAD program. We are working to identify a vendor to generate a state broadband map. So this would be sort of an improved version of our existing broadband map. And we are working to identify and engage a vendor to undertake that process. The state broadband map will show availability statewide, and again, identify locations that are unserved and underserved. And it will continue to show the projects that are going on in Nebraska to address broadband availability. Part of the plan also with identifying the mapping vendor is gathering some information about what it's going to cost to reach the locations that we identify as unserved. That's going to be important in our decision-making process on how we reach these areas. Once we kind of know the allocation that Nebraska will receive from the NTIA for the program, it'll help inform whether the allocation we get is going to be enough to reach all the unserved locations, or if not, how do we stretch those dollars to make sure that we meet the goals of the BEAD program, which is to reach every unserved location. So that's part of the planning process. And we'll kind of evaluate that as we go. Other thing I wanted to mention, we as in the Public Service Commission is in the process of staffing up to meet the requirements and be able to undertake all these efforts. We've hired a broadband attorney. Shanna Knutson was introduced earlier. She's the broadband attorney. We've also hired a human resources generalist, and we are in the process of hiring a number of additional positions, which you should see there on the screen. There's going to be an analyst, accounting assistants. Our outreach coordinator is a pretty important piece of this whole process. We expect that we will hire somebody to fill that outreach coordinator position soon. Auditing help will be part of that process, and some IT help and administrative help are part of who we're looking to add workforce-wise as well. And there may be other entities that we engage to assist in this process as well. So that's all things that the Public Service Commission will be working on in the very short term. So with that, I want to maybe transition a little bit to the FCC broadband map and talk a little bit about what the FCC broadband map is, why it's important, how it works, and finally, what you can do both yourself and in terms of spreading the message to others, what you can do to help maximize and improve the information on the map to make sure that Nebraska is maximizing the amount of funding that it'll receive from the NTIA for this BEAD program. I think we mentioned before that the FCC broadband map was released in November. It's a map that is based, kind of a brand new map. Just a quick background on the older versions of FCC maps. Older versions were based on information on a census block level. So if you're at all aware of what a census block consists of, they were obviously developed by the U.S. Census Bureau. They consist of boundaries that are defined by roads and streams and other political boundaries. They can vary widely in size and number of people that are within census blocks. And because of that, it was maybe at the time a good way to start mapping broadband availability, but over time it has become clear that it is lacking in many respects as a way to define where broadband exists. So people that are familiar with the old census block by census block system, if a carrier could serve one location in a census block that might be, dozens of square miles in area or larger, then the entire census block was considered served. And you could have people, could have locations that were literally several miles apart that were both considered served, even though there was no logical tie to those two locations. So that's all to say that the new version of the broadband map is supposed to be improved, and in a lot of ways it is. It is now based on what they call a fabric. The fabric is really points on the map that identify broadband serviceable locations. So I'll kind of demonstrate the map itself here in a minute here, but basically when you go into the map, you'll see dots of where broadband should be able to be, where broadband should be able to be available, or where there's a need for broadband. And it's literally identifying the structure where broadband could be provided. So it's improvement over that census block by census block methodology that used to be used. The FCC is the federal agency in charge of producing and collecting the information that supports the broadband map. It's still going to be kind of a twice-a-year process where the FCC is collecting information from broadband providers about where they can provide service and at what level of service. But there are processes in place now for interested parties to submit challenges to the FCC's broadband map. And again, I'll go into some detail on that in just a moment as well. There is a bullet point there about availability challenges and a due date for that of January 13th. That is an extremely important date. I'll talk about what an availability challenge is in a minute, but just keep in mind that January 13th is kind of the rough deadline by which availability challenges need to be submitted to the FCC in order to be incorporated into the version of the broadband map that the NTIA will use to determine state allocations of funding for BEAD. That's a lot, but it's essentially saying January 13th. That's an important deadline that will determine a lot about how much support through BEAD that Nebraska receives. And with that, I'm going to stop the presentation and share a browser window. And close a couple of tabs here. So hopefully everybody can see the FCC broadband map. I'll start from the kind of landing page and just quickly go over what some of the options are on the landing page. There are probably I would guess two primary ways that people are going to want to consume the information on the FCC broadband map. The first one is kind of the obvious one. You put your address into the address bar. It'll take you to that location. I'll do that quickly for an address just to show you. And just a note that for whatever reason, and the abbreviation for Nebraska, NE, I think gets translated as Northeast on some of the address corrections. So when you see Northeast, I think it's just a misrepresentation of Nebraska. So you put your address in, it'll take you to that address if it finds it on the map, and you see the dot there. And I'll go into some of the information on the right-hand part of the screen here in a minute, but just wanted to kind of show you what happens as you put in that address. The other way that I think might be helpful for people to consume the map is by clicking on the location option. Location option lets you kind of zoom in and zoom around to different parts of the state. You'll see these hexagons that pop up that are, well, at least for this, what I'm showing on the screen, showing that there's coverage there. As you zoom in further and further, those hexagons get smaller until you zoom in far enough that you'll see those dots again. And when you click on the dots again on the right-hand part of the screen, it brings up some information about the address and the potential providers there. A couple other really quick features I want to make sure I point out when you're looking at this information on the left-hand part of the screen. If you hit the toggle layers button, you can click on satellite data. That'll bring up the satellite imagery that might allow you to see some more detail about what's actually being shown on the map. And then there are toggles for challenge information on the left-hand part of the screen too. And I'll get back to that in a second. I just want to quickly cover some of these other options. You can also look at information on the map by provider. So you click on that. On the right-hand part of the screen, there's an add provider. You start typing in a provider and it'll pop up with their information. You select the technology that you want to see and it'll pop up on the screen. You can see where they serve with that technology that they've reported. And like the rest of these, as you zoom in closer, the hexagons do get a little smaller. For the provider information, you never get down to an actual point on the map. They kind of aggregate that information out a little bit, so you can't quite see that same level of detail. Area is just looking at it by whatever area you want to select. So you can look at the broadband map by state. If you click on that little drop down, you can also break it down by counties or congressional districts, census places, tribal areas, and MSA, I think it's mean statistical area. I can't remember what CBSA stands for, but again, just another way to break down the information and zero in on what you're interested in viewing. And then finally, download. That might be of interest if you're interested in looking at the little bit more detailed information. So you click on the drop-down menu, click Nebraska, and this is where you can start to actually download some of the comma-separated information for different technology types, or by geography type. You can see on the screen there, there's a few different ways that you can download that information. And it's all in comma separated format. So you can, some of the data files are very long, so it doesn't always pull into Excel quite as smoothly as you might otherwise, but there are ways around that. So that's one way you can certainly consume the information. Okay, so I'm just going to point out a couple of ways that you can look at information on the broadband map and potentially provide some very useful information that might assist the FCC and eventually the NTIA in making decisions about broadband funding for states. Let me again put in an address, and we'll kind of start from there. So like I mentioned, there's a point that's supposed to be on that broadband serviceable location. And I want to point out that there are really two types of challenges, and this is a pretty important point. There are two types of challenges that users can submit. The first one is a location challenge. And a location challenge is basically saying, I think the point that is on the map is in the wrong place, or there's no point for something that is a broadband serviceable location. And I'll point out an example here. This is kind of an interesting example of the former of those two options. So if you look at the map that I've shown here, there's a point that appears to be on this kind of long building here. Looks like it's a cattle operation or some sort of livestock. I'm fairly certain that's cattle. But as I look at that, it appears to be probably an outbuilding. Now, that's definitely possible that that is a broadband serviceable location. But as I kind of pan a little bit to the right, it appears there's a home there as well that I would expect to certainly be a broadband serviceable location that does not have a point. So a couple of ways to go about doing that. If you wanted to submit a location challenge for that, you just click on that point. It'll bring up the little challenge location option. You click on that and go through the menu of options here. It'll ask you for a fair amount of information and why you're submitting a challenge, who you are, the description of what you're actually trying to challenge there, and then you have to make a little bit of a certification by checking the box there that this is a legitimate challenge, and you're kind of signing your name to that. Then you'll be able to click submit, and it'll go to the FCC to kind of look through that information and eventually, hopefully, put a point on there that shows that as a broadband serviceable location. You can also click on, so you'll see that we have this address identified in the map. You can click on location challenge, and again, it brings up that menu. You complete the information about what you're trying to challenge there, and click submit to submit that information. And that's all for that. Information is all about location challenges. And again, I do want to highlight that location challenges are important, but they will not likely make any difference to what the allocation of funding is to Nebraska. So I do want to make that clear. We do want to get the map as close to correct as we can. So location challenges are important, but I also want to kind of turn people's focus to availability challenges, because that's sort of the more pressing and more timely issue that I want to make sure we bring up. Location challenge is basically looking at the point on the map and saying that list of providers on the right side, that you see something that's incorrect about that. Maybe in this case, one of those providers, you've tried to get service from them and they are unable to do so. So kind of the same process for submitting a challenge for that type of a scenario. You click on that availability challenge. It will ask you which of those providers you are submitting a challenge for. You select one, and then you go through the menu of options here. I think probably in most cases you want to send your challenge to the selected provider. You put in your name and email, describe why you're submitting the challenge. Excuse me. And it allows you to also submit some additional information if you have, you know, I don't know, something from the provider that shows that they don't provide service there, for example. So when you do click on send my challenge to the selected provider, it also pops up this reason for challenge option. And so these are really the reasons that you are able, these are the allowable reasons for submitting a challenge. Quickly to go through them. One, maybe you've called a provider, wanted them to install service, and they aren't able to do it within 10 days. That's a legitimate reason for a challenge. If you've agreed to a time to have an install and the provider doesn't show up at that agreed upon time, that's a reason to submit a challenge. If they charge you more than a standard installation fee, that's a reason for a challenge. If they've denied you your request, if they denied your request for service, that's a reason. I think probably the provider does not offer the technology reported to be available at this location is maybe the most likely reason that you might submit a challenge. If you have evidence that supports that, hey, this provider can't serve me. I've called them, I've talked to them. Maybe they've even come out to your house and said, nope, we can't serve you. That's probably a really good reason to submit a challenge. There is an option on provider does not offer the speeds reported to be available at this location. I do want to point out that the FCC has indicated that challenges about speeds kind of get treated differently, and that may not work to, it may not be kind of adjudicated so that it impacts the state's allocations for BEAD money, but it is an important, obviously an important thing to make the FCC aware of. But I do want to kind of point out that or actually, I'm sort of stepping ahead of myself. Provider does not offer the speed reported to be available at this location is a good reason to challenge. The next one, actual speed of the service does not match its advertised speed. That's a good reason to challenge, but that will be treated differently by the NTIA. So I kind of messed that up, but so just to kind of clarify that, provider does not offer the speeds reported to be available at this location is a good and helpful reason to challenge for BEAD purposes. And then the actual speed of the service does not match its advertised speed is a good thing to make sure the FCC is aware of. So I do encourage you to submit that challenge, but keep in mind that that may not be something that ultimately impacts BEAD allocations. And then finally, the last two, if you are working with a wireless or satellite provider and the signal isn't available at this location, that's a great reason to submit a challenge. And that maybe in some cases the provider has indicated that they have to construct a bunch of new infrastructure, and they weren't able to do that at the time. So those are all reasons to challenge. Again, we want to encourage as many people as we can to look at their location and make sure that information is correct according to what you know and are aware of. And if it's not, please submit an availability challenge. We think that's a very important thing to make sure that interested parties do in a timely manner. Again, that January 13th deadline is an important one, and I hope we can get as many people to look at their location and submit that information as possible. So let's see. With that, I think I'm going to just take some sharing off. That'll stop on the broadband map. And I'm going to share a presentation because there's one more thing that I do want to mention really quickly. Get to it. I just want to mention one other program that's in progress to work on broadband deployment, and that is the Capital Projects Fund. The U.S. Department of Treasury has allocated money to states to work on broadband deployment. It allocated a little over almost $129 million to Nebraska. And the state legislature kind of divvied that $128.7 million up during that last session into kind of three different places. So part of that money, $40 million, will go to Congressional District 1. And I think I have a map here on the next slide that shows the congressional districts, so it's a little more clear. But $40 million will go to Congressional Districts 1 and 3. Those will both be for broadband deployment. And then no more than $35 million will go to Congressional District 2 for multi-purpose community facilities. We received that federal award in August of 2020. We were approved for the first two parts of that federal award in August of 2022. So we were approved for the Districts 1 and 3 broadband deployment portions. And I'm not sure what the latest is on the Congressional District 2 portion of that money. But the long and the short of it is that the Districts 1 and 3 money will be allocated through our Broadband Bridge grant program with a grant cycle that starts in early 2023. We have put together our procedural schedule for the Broadband Bridge program. You can find that on our psc.nebraska.gov website. Here's just a quick look at where the congressional districts are in Nebraska. Congressional District 1 is the area in kind of light blue there. Hopefully that shows up on the PowerPoint pretty clearly. So Madison, Stanton, Cumming, Platte, Colfax, Dodge, Butler, Seward, Lancaster, Cass, and part of Sarpy counties are part of that district. And then District 3 is in orange. That's kind of the greater, the rest of Nebraska almost, other than Douglas, Saunders, and part of Sarpy County, which are the District 2 areas. So capital projects funds dollars, as I mentioned, that grant fund cycle will be starting very soon. More information on our Public Service Commission website. I urge you to take a look there. And with that, I just want to mention a couple ways that you can get involved immediately in some of the BEAD efforts. First of all, hopefully I've stressed it enough, this BEAD, this FCC map challenge process is extremely important. So if you are able to spread the word on asking people to take a look at their location and submit challenges if that's appropriate, we would certainly appreciate that. I mentioned earlier, if you want to be part of the biweekly newsletters and other updates that we send out, please send an email to connectnebraska@nebraska.gov. Again, next webinar, January 18th at 2:00 p.m. Central. Please join at that point. And just, we'll be putting out more information on some of our additional outreach activities, but we encourage you to attend and participate in those as much as you possibly can. With that, there's some of our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us with questions or comments. And let me see, thought I saw maybe one question pop up in the chat. I will, if I can find it, I will get to that.
I've got the question here. The question is, if I'm correct, these grant funds are only available to smaller communities, villages. Any chance this might change to include truly rural areas? And this question is regarding capital projects funds.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there was some language in the statute, LB 1024 that I mentioned before that that we've interpreted to mean that projects for me see if I can back that up here. That projects for District 3 are supposed to be confined to towns and villages. There's, it's certainly up to the legislature if they think it's important to change that policy. I think that's a possibility that the legislature might look at that language and maybe adjust it during the upcoming session, but ultimately it's up to them to make that change. Let's see. We had a question about getting a copy of the presentation. Yes, this whole webinar we are recording and will make available, and I can certainly make available copies of the presentation as well. So happy to do that. And question about what other marketing is being done to encourage this work. I'm not sure if I quite understand that, other than just to say that our outreach activities are, we're still kind of in the early stages of figuring out just the full breadth and width of what our outreach activities are going to consist of. So we will be trying to put out more information on how that looks as soon as we can make that available. And there's a question about grant money distribution. I'm not sure if I'm going to assume that you're talking about capital projects money, because that's the one grant process that's essentially in place. The way that we have done it in prior broadband bridge cycles, and I think we'll carry on through capital projects, is that we've paid 25% of the grant award upfront, 25% of it at a kind of midpoint milestone. I think it was 9 months, and then the remaining 50% at the completion of the project. So it's kind of and when I say completion of the project, that's not only finishing the construction, but also proving to the commission that the provider can provide the speeds that they're required to, and that they've incurred the actual costs that they're requesting reimbursement for. So it's kind of a reimbursement process at the completion of a project for capital projects funds. Hopefully that answered that question. If not, please feel free to reach out to me separately. I'm happy to provide some additional context to that. So, all right. Well, we're coming up quickly on 3 o'clock. I'm in some ways kind of shocked that we're pretty close to that top of the hour. But just want to say again, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate taking the time today to join this webinar and learn a little bit about what our BEAD processes and activities are going to consist of. Again, I encourage you to try and challenge the map if you see some errors, and please reach out to any of those contacts listed if there are any further questions. So with that, I hope you all stay safe and happy holidays, and hopefully you're able to stay out of the weather that appears to be heading our way. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.